I settled for crazy entrepreneur who works with toilets for a living. Yeah, so it's a weird story.
All right. Aaron Tartakovski, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much. And you said my last name perfectly, which is not easy to do.
I've been rehearsing for quite some time, as you know. I'm very excited to talk about what you're doing with Ep83. It's probably one of the best names for a startup that I've ever heard, and from the few lines that I read about the company, I think it does justice to how awesome what you're doing is. But right before we get there, I'd love to go back and talk a little bit about your background and where you came from, because you've had an interesting mix of studying both at Tufts, but then at Tufts University, to APAC. Also, and now also an investor at J Ventures. So talk to me a little bit about who you are and how you got to found a company called CleanTec.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me. Look, my background, it's not a straight line. I went a lot of different places. I think on paper, what I'm doing now doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm born and raised, nice Jewish boy from San Francisco. I went to school in Boston. Then in Boston, I got really involved in politics. I got involved in politics around the Middle East, around U.S.-Israel policy. So I always knew that I was going to eventually go and spend more time in Israel. And I did.
Why, by the way? Why, coming from San Francisco, going to Boston, why'd you get so passionate and involved with politics there?
This is a long story. It's not just about me. This is more of a family story. So my grandfather, like a lot of people in Israel, but also a lot of Jews and all around the world, we trace our roots to Poland. And my grandfather, as a young teenager, was involved in these, youth Zionist groups, and he was the leader of the youth Zionist group in his little shtetl in the middle of nowhere, Poland. And for him, it was always a dream one day to have a modern day state of Israel. And that's always been important to me, not just because it's in it's in what we read every day in the Haggadah and everything else, but to have in Israel is a miracle now, and I always wanted to be involved in that. And when it comes to politics, America is a special place where we can get involved in politics. We can make changes through politics. And,
very special, right?
I have a father who's a refusnik from the Soviet Union, where the thought of going and actually lobbying for change with your elected officials wasn't something that was possible. And I was very aware that I had this special privilege, and so I got involved in college. That's something that carried with me. I studied history and Jewish studies. So again, on paper, I probably should have become like a professor or a rabbi. Neither of those things happened. And
you settled for a crazy entrepreneur.
I settled for crazy entrepreneur who works with toilets for a living. Yeah, so it's a weird story.
That says it all. Okay, so Aaron, you find yourself in Tel Aviv. You spend some time there, and then you go to APAC. What do you do at APAC?
At APAC, I worked in development. So it was my job to raise money and to educate everyone on the issues of importance to us, issues like the U.S.-Israel relationship, issues like collaboration on not just military things, but on medicine, on technology, on energy, and then also focusing on big world issues like the Iran nuclear program. So those were the things that I was really focused on when I was at APAC.
Wow. Okay, so now let's just jump forward. What do you do with toilets? Why are you so excited and passionate about toilets?
Yeah, it's good. That's a good question. So at Ep83, what we're doing is we are basically rethinking how cities handle both their water and their wastewater. A lot of times we also call wastewater sewage.
Right.
When it comes to cities, we've essentially been doing things the same way for about 200 years, which is to say we go buildings, then into sewers and long, complicated underground networks, then off to central treatment plants.
Right.
And that approach has worked, but we've essentially been doing things the same way that all of our cities, we have more and more people moving into cities, about 70% of the world's population living in cities by 2050. We're putting more strain on all of these pipes and all these facilities that were installed 30 to 100 years ago.
Right.
So actually, we at Epic, we got our roots with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
I was just about to ask because I know that Bill and Melinda, they work vehemently on this topic of better infrastructure for toilets, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Gates Foundation, they had something called the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. And what that said was billions of people around the world don't have access to clean water and reliable sanitation. We can't continue to just build things the same way we have been building big, complicated underground infrastructure. How do we create new, inexpensive, above ground solutions that we can deploy quickly? So our company, me and my co-founders, the start of all of this came out of the Gates Foundation, of sort of designing interesting toilet applications. And by the way, the real genesis of the whole story goes back to the sidewalks of Tel Aviv. One of my co-founders, Oded, was walking down the streets of Tel Aviv with his little pug dog named Pauli. And Pauli did his business on the sidewalk. Oded was not paying attention, didn't clean up after the dog, received a fine from a police officer who saw him not clean up after his dog. And then him being the sort of quintessential fiery tempered entrepreneur, rather than paying the fine and moving on with his life, decided that he was going to come up with a new 21st century solution to clean up after dogs. So like, of course, some Israeli entrepreneur is going to do this. So then they started working with the Gates Foundation, designing toilets. They were then presenting at a conference here in California where me and my father were in the audience. My father is an engineer, originally an engineer in the Soviet space program before he came here as a political refugee.
Wow.
He now designs building systems, mechanical systems, electrical systems, plumbing systems. We said, can we take what we were doing with one toilet for the Gates Foundation, put it into an entire building? And so what we do is, as I said, normally a building, big 40-story high-rise in downtown LA, San Francisco, Boston, or Tel Aviv, everything, all the dirty water goes from the building then into the sewer. What we do is we install our system into the basement of that building. We do two things. One is we pull all of the solids out of the water, all of the organic solids, things that we eat and then go out of our body, and we turn those into fertilizer. So this is really amazing carbon-rich fertilizer we can use in and around cities. The water we then treat and put back into the buildings. We actually help buildings reduce their water needs by anywhere from 40 to 90%. Oh. And I saw your face, and that's what we call in the industry the yuck factor, that people are uncomfortable with this idea. So one important thing is that right now we only reuse water for non-drinking uses. So for toilet flushing, for
I was assuming that you're also trying to make it into a drinkable water.
Eventually, scientifically, we can produce any kind of water we want, but by regulation and frankly, because of the reaction of you and other people, and a lot of people like you, and now we're focused on just reusing water for things, like I said, toilet flushing, cooling towers, which by the way, right, most of the water in buildings is for that anyways.
No. So it's obviously I'm making these faces, but it is solving a huge issue, and you know, lack of accessibility to drinkable water, let alone, you know, water for the toilets is a huge problem. And if you're able to design buildings that are allowing for that to happen, by the way, how much potential could be recycled from the water that we use, let's say on the average flush from a number one or number two?
So on average, with all the water that a building produces, all the dirty water that they create, we can reuse anywhere from 40 to 90% of it.
40 to 90%, which basically means that if we look at the consumption over a week, we can basically narrow it down to the consumption of 2 days out of the week, and that will give us the whole runway. And then what is that going to do to the world? So let's look at the vision further ahead and let's say you're able to implement this in every building in New York and every building in SF. Mm-hmm. What impact, and how does this then later on impact, you know, more the developing areas, or are you not concerned with that yet?
No, we absolutely are. This is a solution that, you know, we're starting in downtown San Francisco because there's a lot of regulations and incentives for it. San Francisco is kind of the start of what we think is sort of going to be a revolution in how cities are designed in terms of their urban water and wastewater. But a helpful analogy of how to think about all of this is decentralization. So you can look at a lot of different industries that have moved away from big centralized infrastructure to decentralized. So one really good example is telecommunications. It used to be we used big poles and wires to connect everything. And then with the advent of cell phones, everything became decentralized. You look at the energy industry where we used to only be focused on big plants, coal plants, nuclear plants, and then we started decentralizing. We started creating wind farms, or we started putting solar panels on people's roofs. We're doing that same decentralization, but for the water, wastewater world. We're just about 15 years behind the energy guys. But that's exactly the way to think of what we're doing is exactly what they did. We're just doing it for a completely different industry.
Right. And how do you get the water back up? So if I'm like on the second floor, does the recycled water maintain on my floor, or is there a whole system that transitions it throughout the building?
Yeah. So the good thing is that pumps, we didn't even have to invent those. We just use pumps, and we can put the water up however high we need. So we're talking now to one project in San Francisco that's 55 stories. We're talking to one project in Seattle that's 90 stories. So we can get the water wherever we need to get it.
Incredible. And does that require the buildings to be planned in advance for this, or can you also go into existing buildings and make those modifications?
So our focus is on new construction. It makes sense. Easier to design for that, but in certain cases we actually can do retrofits. And in fact, in September of 2019, we did a retrofit into a 35-story high-rise in San Francisco called the NEMA building, which is right between the Twitter headquarters and the Uber headquarters. That's our first deployment. And that was a retrofit. And I'll tell you, when it is a retrofit, that means that there's people, in this case, there's 754 fully occupied apartments, which means when we started making adjustments to the pipes, in the industry, we call that a hot tap, which means no matter what, there's going to be stuff coming through those pipes. So we went in at 3 a.m., which when we thought there would be the least amount of flushes in that building. And we kind of sat there, we're all a little nervous as we went up on a ladder, or an elevator ladder, about 20 feet, removed a section of pipe, moved really quickly, and kind of were holding our breath. And guess what? No flushes. We got away without any single flushes coming on us, which, by the way, when you work in this industry and you do what I do, sometimes I'm not neatly dressed and wearing a suit. A lot of times we're getting pretty dirty, but that's what you got to do. That's what you got to do to try to build something different and new. You got to get dirty. And that's an analogy. I think it's a metaphor, not just for us, but for every new project or every new venture.
Right. So, I mean, where is this headed? So give me sort of like, your as a CEO and founder, what is your timeline and vision in the head? When is it, like, what are the different markets you're going after, and when can we expect this to be sort of a mainstream thing where, the average person realizes that the water that they're using in their toilets or in their water fountains for brushing their teeth is actually recycled water from the building?
Yeah, look, it's, as I said, it's starting in San Francisco. So we actually, part of the benefit of coming from politics is we actually helped work with a number of people to make San Francisco the first city in the entire country to require that all new large buildings have to have on-site water recycling systems. So that's actually starting in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
Similar legislation in California. And by the way, look, we as a country in the United States, we recycle maybe 2 or 3% of all of the wastewater we produce. You look at a country like Spain, they're number 2 in the world at around 35%. Israel is closer to 90%. So Israel basically sets the bar for how we should be thinking about water, how we should be thinking.
Israel recycles 90% of its water?
It recycles 90% of all of its wastewater that they produce, yeah.
I had no idea. Wow.
Yeah. Israel's a world leader when it comes to water and water innovation.
I mean, it kind of makes sense. We have to have water in the desert, and we only have this tiny Kinneret, which one year is great, one year it's dried up. So,
right.
So we can't take too many risks. Right. Aaron, did you think you would get into this business? As you're in APAC, or as you're going through your life, did you realize you wanted to build a company that does, that's such a major, impact and a big social impact, actually?
Ever since I was young, I always knew that I wanted to be involved in things that were having a very positive impact on the world.
Yeah.
I didn't know what that looked like yet. Some people know from day one, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a pilot, I want to do this, I want to do that. I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. I thought I was going to go to law school. I thought I was going to try this. At one point, I wanted to be a chef. I wanted to be a veterinarian. But what I knew, sort of the one guiding light for me, was that I wanted to do something that was going to have a big impact on the world. And frankly, I couldn't see myself doing anything that wasn't sort of impact focused. And so for me, I didn't know much about water. I didn't know much about the environment. I didn't know much about climate change or all these big sort of sustainability issues. But I knew that I could learn. I'm a quick learner. And I knew that if I was doing something that I cared about, I would be able to add in all the other important stuff. I would be able to add in the technical skills and everything else. And that's what happened with Epic. Before we officially formed Epic, I spent about 6 months just talking to everyone that he had even sort of a very basic connection to what we were doing. I spoke with building developers, architects, engineers. I spoke with scientists. I spoke with professors. I went to farmers markets and went up to the people and I said, hey, would you use treated human waste on your crops? And I just talked to everyone to just find out what are the problems, what are the red flags, what are the things I should be looking out for. And we just learned. And, you know, there's an element of, we got lucky that five years ago, if you asked someone, can we recycle wastewater in buildings? They would say, I don't know. And now we have laws in the books in San Francisco and in California that make it possible. So, you know, I think to me, when I talk to other sort of people thinking about going into starting ventures and becoming entrepreneurs, you don't need to know all the answers. You just need to be someone who's comfortable with the fact that you're not going to know all the answers for a long time.
And how many other players are in this market right now that are sort of working on similar problems like you are?
When it comes to our competitive landscape, I can name all of those people on one hand.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So definitely, I mean, when you get to a point where a nation or a large city decides that it's important enough to make a law out of this and for any new construction, and you're only one of a few that are able to do this, I think you're in a pretty good position. Aaron, what other things around the world, now that you have experience in looking at these different day-to-day things that we might take for granted as, we don't even, I never even thought about the water that we're wasting through our toilet system. What other things can we be hopeful looking forward that we can sort of revolutionize and make a positive impact on the world?
Look, I'll tell you one thing I'm excited about is that before I started Epic, I ran business development and marketing for a large engineering company, my father's company. And one of the things that I did was I ran the internship program, which means I reviewed every single application that came in. And I'll tell you almost every single application had one thing in common, which was that they wanted to be part of a company that was focused on sustainable design, that was focused on creating healthier, greener, and more sustainable buildings. And so when I look at that to me tells me that there's a whole new generation of engineers who frankly build the world that are focused not just on building things, but on building things better and sort of creating a better future. So when I look at that, I'm not just looking at my industry, I'm looking at every single industry and this new wave of the top engineers, and this is how they're being trained and this is how they think. I'm really optimistic. I think when people, when you think about something like climate change, people kind of always want to find what's the solution, where should we be investing billions of dollars? And what I believe is there's no one silver bullet, but instead we need to use what we call silver buckshot. We need to do a ton of different solutions all at the same time. And that's a quote, by the way, borrowed from Bill McKibben, who's a very well-known climate activist. And, I think really, as I mentioned, when we only recycle 3% of the wastewater in this country, that means we have a long way to innovate, and which means it's exciting. There's so many different things we can be doing.
Of course.
And that's what keeps us excited at Epic CleanTec.
No, definitely. And is the business of doing something like Epic CleanTec, I'm coming from a much more SaaS-oriented place, yeah. And I'm thinking immediately, okay, yeah, so you raise your seed, and then you build your MVP, and then you raise a huge institutional round, and you grow it, and you scale it up. Is that a similar model to running a startup in the space that you're at, or is it much more incremental and less of a hockey stick trajectory?
Yeah. So look, the basic similarities are there. You need grit. You need to be able to deal with failure on many different fronts, both with the product as well as, talking to investors and customers. But it is a different timeline for sure, because, the whole break things and move fast, that whole methodology, it's not necessarily translatable to when you're dealing with something like water, where public health is, that there's, if you mess up, you're going to kill someone or you're going to get someone sick. So we can't take quite the same risks. Plus, we're working in one of the most highly regulated and oldest industries out there. Whereas software is still, in many ways, it's still the Wild West, where we're reinventing new things and thinking of new things. And so
software is eating the world, right? It's
a different approach, and in many cases, we're more similar to kind of the Uber model of regulatory hacking, where it's not just new technology, but you have to figure out how to work within existing power structures of cities. And with industries, in Uber's case with transportation, which, you only have to read about the stories about the taxi unions and that whole industry was very against this. And by the way, take it back even further, when the first trolley cars came to San Francisco, who fought them? All the guys who drove the horse and buggies. The horse and buggy guys, well, these trolley cars are going to put us out of business. This is what happens. Every single generation finds the new innovation that's going to put them out of business. But for us, it's different because we're not going to put water and wastewater plants out of business. We're actually finding a way to work with them. So we work really closely with the utility here in San Francisco. The short answer is our stuff is more expensive. So it's a big physical heavy, we're talking about 10,000 pounds of metal and steel and wires. And so it's different. We don't iterate as quickly, but all of the basic framework of how to build something new is there, which is that you're going to find opposition. You're going to have to get, in our case, literally very dirty. But the basic toolkit is the same.
I love it. Aaron, right before we leave, I have to ask you the most important question. 3 words that best describe you.
I'm going to flip it, and I'm going to say 3 words that my mom would use to describe me. And that is number 1, son. And I'm saying that just in case either of my older brothers, Adam or Joseph, are listening, that I now have put it on the public record that I'm mom's favorite son. So there you go.
I love it. Number 1 son.
Number 1 son.
I love it. Aaron, thank you very much. Toda rabba. It just sounds incredible. I can't wait to move into a building that has this, and I can proudly say that I know one of the pioneers of this who are making a positive impact on the world, and it's really fascinating. Thank you.
You ever want a tour, you let me know.
I just need a couple of extra clothes to take with me, and I'm happy to join in.
We got that. Don't worry.
Toda rabba. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.